kind of a Reader's Digest condensed version of any wisdom I might have picked up, but which is, of course, impossible to do. But I'm a professor, so I have a lectern, and I'll fill the time I was given. I thought I'd mention a few things that were brought to mind, first directed to young educational researchers in the audience. First, I learned from my accidental admittance to Stanford that my college teachers and the standards they set really, really are important. Those professors create an environment, a culture, that if you want to belong to, and I really did want to belong to that culture, you end up taking on their habits of mind. I cannot tell you precisely how that changed me, but I know it did, dramatically. I began to think a little bit like them and interpret the world a little bit like them, and that made me and them very proud. So my first lesson is directed to doctoral students here. Take the best professors and hang out with the smartest people around, so when you steal their ideas, you sound really smart in the next meeting you go to. That gives you a great reputation, and then that gets you invited to the next meeting with smart people, so you can steal or adopt more ideas. The idea is to hang around with really smart people, the best profs you can find, and learn what they have to offer you. Second, I learned from my first experience in a classroom doing research on teaching that there really was no way that the formal experimental psychology I was trained in could prepare me for the world of schools and classrooms within which I wanted to do my research. I remember clearly that day when I was in the back of a classroom, wearing on my face my objective scientific look, trying to be invisible and unobtrusive as I walked around a classroom and coded teacher and student behavior. Then suddenly a second grader tugged at my pants leg and said, "Mister, can you help me with this?" This was an existential as well as a methodological moment. Kid or research protocol? Kid or science? Kid or methodological purity? That was the day I discovered that traditional research designs that work so well in laboratories are very hard to use in classrooms. And so some kid got to do two-column subtraction a little better, I hope, as I learned to cope with the complexity of schools. So my second lesson is, overhead please, there are lots of ways to do informative and well-warranted research while being an integral part of the scene you are studying. There are methodologically sound ways of studying teachers in classrooms, some of which even provide you better information than if you remained an outsider to the domain you want to know about. The ethic or outsider and the emic or insider forms of research each can yield useful and different knowledge. All research of whatever form has to pass the same smell test. Namely, are the conclusions reached in the study worth taking seriously? Are they well warranted, or do they smell fishy? Same test. My third point is also for the young faculty and budding scholars, and it's concerned with what I learned about tenure. Certainly in a university, you should do what you need to earn that honor, and it is an honor. But despite what the public thinks, tenure never assures job security. In this economic downturn, we've all learned a little bit about that. It really ensures only that you cannot be forced out of your job easily for opening your mouth, for writing op-ed pieces, for being politically active, for disagreeing and even being disagreeable with powerful people, chief state school officers, governors, and the like. Next overhead, please. Tenure protects your mouth, which in a democracy is critically important. There is a kind of obligation to use this gift of tenure to do work in the public interest and to speak what you consider to be truth to power. You have been given the right to speak up and speak out and not be hassled for that. And although the system sometimes fails, it mostly works, thank goodness. So the lesson I learned is that not only can I speak up, I found that I was kind of obligated to speak up, that I really enjoyed the sparring, and I enjoyed taking on the honorable role of public intellectual, because that's what I believe my tenure was really granted for. I'll explain that with what now is a funny story. I was called into the governor's office when I was the dean because she didn't like some things I was doing, and the college wasn't her favorite place. She lambasted me for a while, and I was properly contrite. But I eventually said, "Governor, I'm a professor. That's what you pay me to do. It doesn't mean I'm right on every issue I speak up about, but it does mean I have thought about the issue, and because I am a professor for the state of Arizona, I have this obligation to go ahead and profess. I should say what I believe to be the case. She didn't really like that, but the meeting was ending, and as we left, her aide, who had been present the whole time, kind of smirked and said to me as we walked out, "Tough meeting, huh?" And I said, "Nah, I'm tenured and she's not. I'll be around long after she's gone." And guess what? That's what tenure is for. In the areas of your expertise, speak up. It's your duty, especially after they grant you tenure. Okay, now I'll address a few more general issues that are floating on my mind in our times. As I became less of a research producer and more of a policy analyst, I have learned that the majority of the business and political community has misunderstood the performance of the public schools or deliberately chosen to portray public schools in a bad light. That is, in my humble opinion, most people in business and politics on issues of education are either dumb or lie. Moreover, I'm afraid that sometimes people like former Secretary of Education Rod Page and former head of IBM Lou Gerstner are both. See what I mean about tenure? It's a wonderful gift. 130 years ago, Americans were listening to business leaders and politicians who told us that our nation is in danger because we couldn't keep up with our German and British rivals in the world marketplace. But we did. 100 years ago, those leaders told us we couldn't educate the ignorant and genetically inferior foreign masses coming to our shores, Jews and Poles and Italians and Chinese. But somehow their kids managed to do just fine. As I grew up, Americans learned that Johnny couldn't read and we were losing the educational race to the Russians, who might well bury us someday. But they didn't. As I went to college, it was the Japanese that our business and political leaders said we couldn't compete with. Later, Bill Bennett and the writers of A Nation at Risk told us that we were incapable of competing economically. We were a nation at risk in a world that was beating us in every way. But then, of course, we had the 90s and the dot-com boom, where we generated more wealth in a decade than the world had generated in millennia. Now, according to our new Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and Bill Gates, we cannot keep up with the Indians and the Chinese. When should we call this extensive record of fear-mongering predictions in which the schools are implicated in the demise of America what it really is? Bull. So my third lesson that I hope all of you keep in mind is that, next overhead please, an economy runs well on such things as innovative thoughts along with copyright and patent protections, access to capital and trained labor, stable money supply, relatively low tax rates, and relative freedom from corruption in our courts and among our police, transportation systems that are dependable, cheap energy, and so forth. The schools play little or no part in the economic success of a nation after a reasonable level of literacy and numeracy is achieved, which it is in all the industrialized countries. We compete on other levels. Okay, my fifth point. The ability to change the achievement of students in our schools by means of a stronger accountability system was predicted to fail by many, and it is. It is now clear that the rate of gains on the NAEP tests, our nation's best tests, were greater before the No Child Left Behind law was passed than after it was passed. The No Child Left Behind law has collided with Campbell's law, and Campbell's law, social science law of great ubiquity, wins. Campbell's law states that if you value any social indicator too much, like stock prices or test scores, then the indicators and the people who use them both become corrupt, which is why the stock market crashed and the scores can't be trusted. After 7 years, the patently obvious failure of strong accountability systems to improve our schools and reduce the achievement gap between poor kids of color and middle-class kids who are white should open the way to another theoretical approach, namely that various forms of social and economic inequality are the root cause of the lower achievement by some students that we worry about. I've come to understand that my democracy isn't all that good at spreading the enormous wealth it has around. Because of our nation's large income differentials that then result in housing patterns tied to income, poor children come into schools that primarily serve poor children. School segregation by income and therefore race may now be at an all-time high because it's in the North as well as the South. Not only do schools that serve the poor have less money, newer teachers, less well-prepared teachers, more teachers teaching out of field, and students who enter school well behind in language acquisition and who then lose ground in the summer, They also have children and families who are English language learners, have children with higher rates of special needs, higher rates of mental illness of both parents and children, higher numbers of hungry and poorly nourished children, higher rates of ill children, particularly lead-poisoned and asthmatic children, children who regularly witness violence in their homes, leading to brain and endocrine system changes that are not conducive to learning, children who move homes frequently, and so forth. So my fourth lesson learned is this. Overhead, please. If you think the cause of low achievement and gaps in achievement are because of lazy teachers and students, then perhaps a high-stakes test with which to club those people into higher performance through embarrassment and sanctions is a reasonable social policy. But if you got it wrong, if you have your theory wrong, you mess up the schools and you screw up America. That is what I think is happening now. I'm convinced that greater achievement on tests might arise from our development of universal health care, hiring more counselors and nurses in schools for the poor, ensuring that school breakfasts, lunches, and weekend meals are actually delivered to poor kids, designing summer educational programs to stop summer losses in achievement, granting housing vouchers to reduce mobility, conducting family violence prevention workshops and parent education programs, and so forth. I'm convinced it's the out-of-school factors that are bigger blocks to achievement in America than it is lazy teachers and lazy students. Next overhead, please. What I've come to believe, is that America needs a two-way accountability system. Schools certainly need to be accountable to the public for their performance, and the public needs to be accountable for sending to our schools children who are physically and mentally healthy, ready to learn, and who live in communities and homes that are safe and nurturing. Children who do not meet these kinds of quality standards for entrance into our schools simply cannot be expected to easily meet the curriculum and performance standards set by Arizona and the other states as required by No Child Left Behind laws. A lot more resources need to flow to the schools that serve poor children. It's not unheard of, I actually know of two, but schools that are successful with such children over long periods of time and with different administrators are rare, unless they are skimming and dropping children or have lots of extra resources, as do some of the most successful charters. It's hard to teach well in schools that serve the poor. A sixth lesson I've learned is that it's that language matters a lot in public policy. The journalist and bilingual education scholar Jim Crawford called my attention to how the Bush administration turned our concern for equal educational opportunity into a concern about the achievement gap. And in so doing, the Bush folks took our concern away from inputs to the schools, equal educational opportunity, and made us think about the outputs of our schools, the achievement gap. It's as if the inequalities, the out-of-school factors I just mentioned, upon which so much depends, are irrelevant. What matters now is getting rid of the achievement gap between whites and blacks or between Anglos and Hispanics. It's a great switch. It's brilliant because we switched from blaming ourselves or society because of its maldistribution of wealth and opportunity. We switched it to blaming teachers and administrators for the gap that they must have caused because they're right there in the schools where the gap is showing. This is brilliant politics, but this is bad for the nation, and it continues in the current administration. The word accountability is a problem also. It implies counting, assigning numbers to things, but the root is probably in the phrase to give an account. That is, to give voice to what happened. But voices are not evidence in either this or the last administration, and thus the voices of literally millions of teachers are not heard as our government begins to reauthorize the No Child Left Behind Act. Voice is important. People lead storied lives. They happily and naturally share their stories, their accounts. By focusing on one set of meanings associated with the word accountability, we silence another way of getting first-hand knowledge from people living the experience in which we are interested. On a related issue, I heard the Secretary of Education the other day talk of data-driven decision-making for our schools. It's a common phrase these days all around the country. You hear it all over Arizona. But wasn't General Motors and Chrysler data-driven? And look at them. Hasn't Motorola been the most data-driven company in the world, extolling us here in this college about the business methods that made Motorola famous in the 80s? Of course, now they're about to lose their cell phone business, though it was driven by data. I think the schools need to drop the phrase data-driven strikes me as kind of stupid, actually. Schools should certainly talk of data-informed decision-making, but data-driven is a crazy thought, suggesting that the data stands someplace separate from a human mind that must make judgments about the meaning of those data. Language matters. Data may inform, but I wouldn't let them drive me anywhere. Here is one more the new Secretary of Education is using. He talks a lot about pay for performance. Well, it's not that at all. He really is talking about pay for test score. And if he pays for test scores to go up, then they will. That is what Campbell's law tells us will happen. If the Secretary wanted to evaluate teachers' performance, then generalizability theory from the field of measurement informs us that he would probably need as many as 5 different accomplished teachers to go into a teacher's classroom on perhaps 5 different occasions to judge that teacher's performance. This is an expensive but quite defensible way to judge and pay for performance. But the Secretary wants to pay for student test scores, not for visits by competent evaluators. And by the way, the correlation between a teacher's classroom mean performance on achievement tests from year to year is about 0.30, indicating that in any one year you could win a big bonus and the next be brought up on charges of incompetency, and all because of the kids you draw from one year to the next. So the language in the program, as far as I can tell right now, is ludicrous. And that is not noticed in the news reports about the Secretary's new agenda. There are plenty of other words around that mess with our minds. Reform is one I've never liked, like in reform schools or reform the schools. Doesn't that imply faults that must be remediated? But in the last TIMSS testing, the International Science and Math Test, 20 million kids that were in schools without much poverty, were only beaten by 2 countries. And some of our states performed right up there with the best performing countries in the world. So improve always. Reform, well, only if something is broken, like our income tax code and our healthcare system. But not all of our schools need reform. Many are doing really well. They don't need to be reformed. They need to be honored. Proficient, that's another word floating around, and which all our students have to be someday. But proficient is a place somewhere above average, according to the dictionary, though no one knows where above average. The law signed by most members of Congress on both sides of the aisle expects 100% of the kids in America to be above average in the year 2014. Now that's amazingly stupid lawmaking. So I suggest, next over. Watch for language traps. George Lakoff informs us that words evoke frames that then condition our thinking. Linda Darling Hammond, a recent candidate for Secretary of Education, was reported all across America as backed by the union. Arnie Duncan, the president's eventual choice, was reported all over as an independent reformer from Chicago. Union bad, reformer good. Union status quo, reformer change agent. Examine the words and the frames that are used by people in discussing education. As it turns out, Linda Darling Hammond has an extensive record of reform, and Arnie Duncan looks like he's a pawn of the neoliberal forces in Chicago and the business community. Yet it all got twisted by the language being used. Examine the words and the frames that are used by people in discussing education. Many of them are designed to evoke more than what first meets the eye, and it is so easy to get trapped. I do expect to retire eventually, but that obligation to criticize and speak up doesn't stop when I lose my tenured professorship. It just means that the university can distance itself from me, happily, and I can fulfill my obligations as a citizen in the same ways that I tried to fulfill them as an academic. You read, you write, you think, you argue, you drink wine, you eat well. Thank you.